Welcome back. In today's episode, we will be continuing from episode 6. 7 was just kind of like a little intermission, something I just kind of wanted to talk about. But now we are back on schedule with the chronological order. Now, we are actually in the part of the series which is my favorite. With both sides of my family having deep ties to the Lowcountry for centuries, I might add. I'm sure I'm going to be biased, of course, but in these next few videos, I will actually cover one of the most important and sought after regions. And if you don't know, that's going to be the southeastern region of the United States. This video will be one that will shed light on a lot of the misconceptions regarding the people, the culture. So if you're from South Carolina, especially the Low Country, or even coastal Georgia and the Sea Islands across both states, or if you have blood ties to those that are known as the Gullah Geechee, you most definitely would want to follow the rest of this series, as I'll be going through their origins, just going through the origins of our Gullah history and not linguistically, because I think it's more important to start from the source, and the source is the people. So that's where we will be starting. Now, and regardless of the many narratives of our people coming over from West Africa, and I'm talking specifically to like the Gullah people of the Low Country, like those sea islands, the coastal regions of Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida, North Carolina too, because they are a part of that Gullah Geechee corridor. But just wanted to say, there's a lot of people that have the school of thought where our ancestors came from Sierra Leone and Liberia. That they came over to the Low Country region as slaves, and that's where a lot of the culture come from. And I just want to point out that it's actually vice versa. From Charleston, many people were shipped to Liberia, and people of color, that is. And of course, because Charleston was, just as it is now, back then it was a super important port. So, starting in 1820 through the American Colonization Society. So, the Colonization Society basically deported thousands of people of color. And the funny thing is, they did all of that only for a lot of their future generations to return back um, to this area. And of course, after living among Maroons from the Caribbean of indigenous origin. And the thing is, even before that, however, the people of the Low Country and its surrounding areas were being shipped around the Caribbean and other places near and far from their home. As stated in a prior video, during the 16 and 1700s, more Indians were being shipped from Charleston than Africans were being imported in. And no, the art of sweetgrass, basket weaving, or the love for rice, as it's, basically a main staple in our food. Even the ring shout dances, that was said to come from West Africa, right? So none of that actually came from ties to West Africa, but they were all actually a part of the indigenous culture who were already present in the area. Here is a relative of mine actually showing his handmade split oak basket, um, which was one of the many weaving techniques that were done in the region. And it's funny because if you actually just look up the history of that in the region, which I will have here on the screen, and you can just read that. So anyway, um, but you will also see how a lot of the family holistic remedies that a lot of us grew up on, and again, I'm talking specifically right now, just right now, to the people who are from the Gullah Geechee like culture, right? So a lot of the home remedies, whether it's growing up with sassafras or rabbit tobacco, which some people consider, they call it life everlasting, depending on which area you're from, or from pine needle tea to slow molasses, or even using tobacco smoke to cure oral thrush, right? Like all of the things um, of that nature ties the culture back to the people of the pre-European contact. So by the end of these next few videos, you will see that there is a distinct difference between Native Americans and American Indians. And even though the two are used interchangeably, they shouldn't be. Um, Native Americans refer to your Asian mestizos, right, with Mongoloid phenotypes. If you recall from my previous videos, you will see that the Spanish were bringing in Asians since the 1560s to their territories, all in the Americas. And this was done by way of the Manila Galleon. So many of those Asians that were brought here would actually marry into indigenous populations and live among them, away from the Spaniards. American Indians, however, when I speak of them, I'm referring to the people who were here during the actual start of European contact in the 1400s and 1500s. I'm talking about the copper-colored races who were also subjected to slavery in the Americas. Now, to put things in perspective, just so we don't leave any open-ended conclusions to what I mean. American Indians were the first people to be enslaved heavily in this region throughout the era of American slavery. And when you see depictions of these slaves, and trust me, if you live in the Southeast, oh, you do, especially where I'm in Charleston, of course, that period was a very important period in this region. So you still see a lot of that in the culture in the city. So, the one thing you will know for sure, looking at those depictions, you aren't seeing Native Americans. You are looking at American Indians. Now, the Seminole Wars, the Yamasee War, the Tuscarora War, the Pequot War, the Powhatan Wars, the Natchez Wars, right? Those wars were not fought by Native Americans. They weren't present in the Southeast during that time. Those all were fought by American Indians. And again, when you look at any artistic depictions, which they're not going to be 100% accurate either, but I'll tell you what you're not seeing in those depictions. And that's the people that are considered Native Americans. Again, those are your American Indians. But by the end of this series, you will be able to see what I mean when I say that. But right now, let's take a look at some of the early European interactions in the area and their wars with other Europeans. Following the well-proven method, of course, of using different tribes against each other to further their agenda or, completely take over the local government and the resources of the land for their nations while making slaves of the native population. So, a recent finding of a historical document that was sent from a Spanish ambassador to Portugal by the name of D. Alonso de Tovar to King Philip II, which was dated May 20th, 1563. It sheds a new light on the key players behind the big names who were detrimental, I should say, in the success of the early explorers during the Age of Discovery. It was a Portuguese oceanic pilot by the name of Bartolomeu Borges. That last name, hey, if you know, you know. And if not, we'll get more on that later. But he was actually the pilot that guided the French crew to Florida just 1 year prior. Now, at times, these pilots whom I've actually spoke on in previous videos, they had extraordinary knowledge of the open seas and would actually take on that role of pilot by choice. But for Bartholomew, it was quite different as he was kidnapped by the French and forced to take them to Spanish Florida. Now, this would have been a very scary ordeal for him as the French and his nation were enemies. Now, working for the Spanish as a navigator for Don Juan Tella de Guzman to escort treasure ships from the Caribbean back to Spain, which was a very dangerous job, by the way, because you always had pirates. And pirates are nothing but people who were on the open highways, and back then that was the ocean ways, and basically robbed them for their goods. So, to be a navigator escorting those treasure ships a lot of times came with a lot of action. Now, during a Caribbean voyage, he was captured by the French pirate Francois Leclerc. Now, Francois, who was provided with the first letter of marque for the waters of the Caribbean, and he was basically forced to lead them throughout the region to raid the Spanish. So it was Leclerc who recommended Gaspar de Coligny to use the Portuguese oceanic pilot for knowledge of the open seas and the routes and locations to the Spanish. The French already having knowledge of the Americas and a few colony attempts came to the southeast. And in 1562, Gaspar de Coligny, who was a Huguenot leader of a high societal class, him along with John Ribault, respected by all as he was one of the finest naval officers that France has ever had. Now, he was a French naval officer under Coligny, but they founded Charles Fort near Port Royal Sound, present-day Paris Island. Now, a fun fact to my fellow Lowcountry Carolinians, Colony Beach at Hilton Head, South Carolina, is actually named after Gaspar to commemorate his landing, as Port Royal Sound is only about a 12-mile stretch from the beach. Now, there the French would create the short-lived Charles Fort at nearby Paris Island, where it remains are actually still there today. Now, another interesting fact is that after the Spanish ran the French off from that area and rebranded that area as Saint Helena, it became the first, not the second, not the third, but the first capital of Spanish Florida. In fact, most of the Lowcountry was a part of Spanish Florida during this time. Now, to be politically correct, however, before either the French or the Spanish laid claims to this area, this was actually a part of the Indian Hill site. Now, this site dated to around the year 900 and lasted to about the 1400s, allegedly. Now, this site was a major ceremonial center for ceremonial and social functions. The Indians there, being a part of the mound builder, aka Mississippian societies, would have left remnants of the mound, which is measured around 13 feet high with the base width over 130 feet. Now, again, this is what's left today, as I am most certain that the site was of a much larger and grander scale at the time, and probably lasted much longer than 1400 and closer to the initial contact with the Europeans. Anyway, back to my main point. There will be plenty of historical gems that I'll be dropping regarding the Low Country all throughout this series. So don't worry there. You're definitely going to get your dose of local history. Now, Coligny, he was the Admiral of France, a title created during the Eighth Crusade by Louis of France. Now, the duty of the admiral was to defend the coast of Picardy, Normandy, Nice, and Santage. However, during times of war, he was responsible for assembling the French merchant ships into a navy, as well as handing out letters of marque to corsairs. The role of handing out letters of marque is a fancy way of contracting legal pirates to attack and capture ships belonging to nations who you were currently at war with. With the capturing of ships, they were able to sell the ship and take the crew members as prisoners, all for a profit. Now, in time of peace, the role would change to maintaining the naval fleet and being responsible for maritime commerce. Colony converted from the Catholic faith during the reign of King Francis II around 1559, who took the throne after a freak accident that led to the death of his father. There were religious wars going on in France between the Huguenots, which basically just mean Protestants, and the Catholic factions, which was the cause to many deaths in the region. Now, to help understand why the Huguenots wouldn't have settled in Canada, which was already discovered by Cartier, you have to keep in mind that Catholicism ruled French Canada. Now, having major conflicts with the Catholics, finding an area away from them would have been a strategic move that was essential for survival. Now, to retaliate against the Catholics, the French tried to kidnap the crowned king, Francis II, to remove him from the influence of the devoutly Catholic house of Guise, who just happened to be his uncles. The Amboise conspiracy is what I'm talking about. Now, of course, they would kidnap him to possibly take over the crown for themselves and rule, reversing the policies against them. Many Huguenots were executed as retaliation of the conspiracy, prompting the search of a place of refuge for the Huguenots. Sensing that there would soon be a big blowout, Colony decided to sail to the Americas with a group of some 100+ Huguenots. And that was around this time where Ribault helped lay the plans for a fort and then returned to Europe, leaving some 27 men behind to man it, awaiting his return with more supplies. Now, the local indigenous tribes would welcome the colonists with food and other goods needed to help them survive, as they saw an enemy of their enemy, which were the Spanish, as their friends. The Huguenots, who were left behind, their storehouse eventually burned down, and the colonists were actually beginning to become starved out. So after about a year, the fort was abandoned, and all except one colonist left to head back to Europe. The colonists running out of supplies and not being aware of the religious wars that were being basically in full swing by this time back in Europe, which actually held up Ribault from returning. Now, once back in Europe, Ribault took part in the wars. Now, taking a chance with the natives, the lone Frenchman was accepted by the locals, who would have most likely been the Timucua. Another fort, Fort Caroline, was established near the mouth of Johns River in Florida, present-day Jacksonville, by René Goulain de Laudonnière. Now, this was in 1564. Not only was this a place of refuge, but it was also a chance to slow down the Spanish colonization. It was here where the French became allies with a powerful Timucua chief named Satiriwa. Satiriwa was a paramount chief, having sway over 30 other villages. Now, being allies, the chief expected the French to help him defeat his enemy, who was also a great chief, and actually the chief of the Agua Fresca peoples, who went by the name of Utina or Utina. Now, ultimately, causing the French to ally with him instead of leading to, instead of them allying with the French and allying with the Spanish, this basically led to Satiria's defeat. So once Spain caught wind of the French in Florida, King Philip II sent Pedro Menendez de Aviles to Florida, not only to establish a colony for Spain, but to also deal with the French settlements. In 1565, there was an asiento given to Pedro Menendez by King Philip, which required him to create two towns in which each would settle 500 Spaniards, where he would also introduce horses and cattle, spread religion, and make slaves of the indigenous using the repartimiento system. Now, in the last video, I explained what that system was, which was basically slavery under a different name. Yes, this system made the natives work, and yes, it made them provide all of their resources for the settlers. The Indians were made to provide food and defense for the settlers, building up their colonies near and abroad, labor in the gold and precious metal mines, give control to their trade networks to the Spanish. Now, Menendez located the Huguenots' fort, and along with his troops, slaughtered everyone with the exceptions of women, children, Catholics, and musicians. So, trying to escape the Spanish wrath, some Huguenots were able to make it back to their former fort, aka Charles Fort, only to be pursued and slaughtered. The Spanish took over Charles Fort, and that's when it became known as St. Helena, present-day Paris Island, which is about 8 miles from St. Helena Island today, and 8 miles as the two closest points from island to island going by water. Now, the Spanish also took over Fort Caroline in present-day Jacksonville, renaming it San Mateo, not far from where the Spanish conducted the massacre of Matanzas, also killing John Ribault in the process. Now in 1568, as a direct result of this massacre of Matanzas, French nobleman Dominique de Gourgues sold all of his assets to be able to hire 3 ships along with crew to wreak havoc on the Spanish at Fort Caroline, as the Spanish was responsible for the death of his close friend. Now, joining forces with their old ally, which I'm talking about the indigenous people, they captured and hung the Spanish prisoners. This would cause the founding of the Spanish city of St. Augustine, which became the new capital of Spanish Florida after St. Helena. Now, as mentioned earlier, the names that Europeans use for different indigenous peoples they encountered were not the names that they used for themselves. The names used could have come from the location of the indigenous, aka, oh wow, look at these people over here by the creek. Okay, cool, these are the Creek Indians, right? So when you hear terms like Creek Indians, names like that was given because of their location where they were spotted by the Europeans. Now, and I'm just saying them also, it also could be the names which their rivals would have given them, right? So when, for instance, I mentioned in the other video where it was the Aztecs that gave the Tarascans their name. However, that was a derogatory term, and it was coming from people who were their enemies. You also had Europeans that would just butchered a version of the original name. So with that being said, we cannot say with 100% accuracy the names that the different tribes of the Americas called themselves. And also, you would have tribes that would restructure and join with larger tribes for different reasons. The names that they went by could have changed. Now, the different tribes of Florida would continue to deal with the encroaching Europeans who were starting to make more of a presence and become more of an issue for them. Now, as mentioned earlier, De Soto made his way to the American Southeast in the 1530s, where he left a lasting impression of the Spaniards on the natives. De Soto craved to climb the social ladder, and after being granted permission from Charles V to explore and colonize Florida, he intended to find the next Peru with the hope of being exalted up through the nobility chains. In 1537, Emperor Charles V appointed De Soto as governor of Cuba and the vast region called La Florida, but now encompassed the entire southeast, which would also be his base of operations for his future missions in what was known as the Kingdom of La Florida. The capitulation also gave him a royal license to conquer established Spanish settlements and a portion of any wealth found. And, of course, the right to enslave the indigenous of the areas and force them to support his efforts. The title of adelantado and the right to any resources and men from Cuba. Now, Hernando de Soto will leave Cuba, placing his wife of noble Spanish lineage, Doña Isabel de Bobadilla, in the role of governor. This would make Donna Isabel the first European female governor in the New World. Just throwing that out there. Now, making his way from the modern city of Tampa Bay along with his crew of soldiers, priests, women, and animals, they made camps with native tribes in the area. Now, it was during this time that a Spanish survivor from the earlier Narvaez expedition by the name of Juan Ortiz was found. Now, Ortiz's story, although around 70 or so years prior, sounds uncannily like that of John Smith and Pocahontas. Now, by no means necessary am I saying that these stories are just being recycled to fit whatever colony attempt to explain first contact or to explain the legitimacy that they have to the land through the indigenous. You know, whether it's your Malinches, Pocahontas, Anywho, all I'm saying is that the stories are very similar. Now, captured by the Tocobaga tribe who had a disdain for Europeans, Ortiz was tied above a fire and ordered to be roasted alive until he was saved by Princess Ulele. Now, you think shows like The Game of Thrones or Chief of War is exciting? You should try reading first-hand accounts of the explorations and colonization of the Southeast, and you will easily have an award-winning show. Now, the hatred that he had towards the Spaniards was warranted, as Cacique Herejigua would have experienced firsthand how violent and demanding the Europeans were. From disrupting trade to kidnapping tribesmen and forcing them to do hard labor while mutilating or killing those who pushed back, many warriors took revenge whenever they could. The cacique captured 4 Spaniards, one being Ortiz. Now, approaching a festival, the chief had plans for his captives, which would end in their death while also making them a huge part of the festival. The cacique had the Spaniards brought to a plaza where they were given the objective to stay alive. Now, if any of you have seen the movie Apocalypto, and the scene where the different captives were basically put out in a big field in a plaza and forced to run, this is exactly what happened. Now, however, this account didn't come from the movie, as this is from the 1500s. But just listen to how this played out centuries before the movie even became a thought. The Spaniards were forced to run the length of a plaza while warriors shot arrows at them, like a cat playing with a mouse before ending its life. Now, to extend the entertainment for the crowds, the Indians would toy with them before killing them, as they were master archers. Now, after killing 3 of the 4 captives, the cacique's wife and daughter pleaded with him to spare Ortiz, as it was said that he was only a child around the age of 18 and did not deserve the fate as his comrades. So, allowing Ortiz to live a few days longer, while continuing his torturing tactics, of course, Herihigua brought Ortiz to near death just to revive him, just to do it all over again. Now, this is something that you're going to see in these upcoming videos, is that when it came to torture, the indigenous people of the Americas, they weren't rookies. Now, having a kind heart and feared for what would happen to Ortiz, the chief's oldest daughter coordinated his escape, where she provided him with an Indian who became allies of the Spanish and also had a soft spot for her. The Indian who wanted the princess' hands in marriage was Kozo, a chief himself and a known lover of the Spanish, which made others dislike him. Ortiz would live with the chief for about 10 years as his right-hand man, while learning their customs and becoming like an Indian himself. So, like I said, he was taken in by Moscoso before ultimately being returned to the Christians. So Ortiz would then join De Soto's men after joining them. And of course, he would share his massive amount of intel about the Florida Indians that would make the Spanish super successful at allying with those who did not want war and destruction for those who did not play by their rules. Every indigenous village in the Spaniards' path was not destroyed, nor did every village fight back. You had some who fled their towns to take refuge in the woods and nearby swamps for protection, as they knew what the others' fate was. This would be the case of Cacique Ocali, whose village was left wide open for the Spanish to occupy, as they took any provisions they saw. Now, even so, his people were still raided for slaves, in which the Spanish was ordered to take as many as they could, leaving with about 30. Now, it was the incidents that happened next that would make the Spanish infamous among the Timucua people. While moving through Florida, De Soto would enslave, mutilate, and kill natives at will. War was made with the Napituca, in which over 200 warriors were massacred, making it the first massacre to take place on American soil by Europeans. And by American, I'm talking United States. So, now also, there were several tribes that successfully repelled the Spanish. And one group of the Timucua, the cacique, he basically did a phenomenal job, to say the least. And this was Cacique Acuera, who ruled the modern-day Ocala, Florida. When the Spanish approached him with their offer of peace, the cacique was quick to let the Spanish know that he knew who they were and what they have done, and how basically they have been to their lands earlier and caused destruction. He then called the Spanish professional vagabonds who go from place to place, making their living by robbing, killing, and enslaving people who have done no evil deeds against them. He also informed the Spanish that they were not afraid of them, and that as long as they were in their territory, their lives would be in danger, as he promised nothing except war against them until he died. Now, stating that him and his people would suffer death 100 times instead of being a servant to anyone, as they were free men on their own land. And being true to his word, his tribe was known to annihilate any Spaniard who was 300 feet or more outside of their fort, bringing the heads of the dead to the cacique. many other chiefs had the same sentiment towards the Spaniards, and any natives that vouched for them or surrendered basically became their enemies. Now, you will actually start to see the division between a lot of different regions too, based off how friendly they were towards Europeans, because it's almost like these were the people that are responsible for my people destruction, yet you welcome them with open arms. So now you're my enemy. And even after the Spaniards left that area, a lot of these beefs continued. But let's carry on. Now, another noteworthy mention of someone who felt strongly against the Spanish was the cacique Verachucha or Verachuco, their present day Gainesville, whom I will quote a portion of his response to his siblings who begged him to become vassals of Spain, as written by the Inca nobleman Garcilasca de la Vega, who himself was a descendant of Pachacuti and Manco Copac. How that quote was, "For you to say what you have said about these Spaniards would make it appear that you are mere boys, lacking in judgment and experience. You praise them extensively as virtuous people who have done no harm or damage to anyone, and you proclaim them to be very valiant men who are sons of the sun and such merit whatever service may be rendered them. The bondage in which you have placed yourselves and the vile and cowardly spirit that you have assumed in the brief time since giving yourselves up to serve as slaves of Spaniards make you talk like women, praising as you do people whom you ought to vituperate and abhor. Do you not see that since these Christians are of the same government and race as those who perpetrated so many cruelties among us in the past, that they can be no better? You take no note of their treason, and if you were men of good judgment, you would perceive that their very lives and deeds reveal them to be sons of the devil rather than sons of our gods, the sun and the moon. For they go from land to land, killing, robbing, and sacking whatever they find, and possessing themselves of the wives and daughters of others without bringing any of their own. They are not content to colonize and establish a site on some of the land that they see and tread upon, because they take great pleasure in being vagabonds and maintaining themselves by the labor and sweat of others. If, as you say, they were men of virtue, they would not have left their own country, for there they could have employed their strength in sowing the land and raising cattle to sustain their lives without damage to others, and without increasing their lives without damage to others, and without increasing their own infamy. But they have made highwaymen, adulterers, and murderers of themselves without shame of men or fear of any God. Warn them, therefore, not to enter my land, for I promise that no matter how valiant they may be, if they put foot upon it, they shall never leave it, since I shall destroy them all. Half of them I shall bake, and the other half I shall boil." Just let that sink in for a minute. Now, this was actually the sentiment of a lot of tribes that the Europeans encountered. And as mentioned before, when a lot of these different indigenous tribes, especially like those like the Calusa or other tribes of Florida or the Southeast, they were just painted as violent, vicious people that would raid these settlements and attack them unprovoked and kill, women, children, everybody. It wasn't because they were bad people. it's because they've already experienced the wrath of just a handful of the same people that were now coming in drives and waves, and basically them facing the threat of experiencing a whole new wave of that prior savagery. They decided to give it all they got and attack. Now, back to the story. So, following the trail of DeSoto, after he made it out of Florida, he continued traveling to Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana. By 1540, DeSoto and his followers reached Georgia's Chickasawhatchee Swamp, where they came in contact with the Capachecchi. Chiefdom where the indigenous that spotted them fled, and warriors that came to contact with them attacked. Now, once again, the Spanish resorted back to their methodology, and that was extracting information from the Indians that they encountered about gold, forcing them to provide them with much needed sustenance, labor, guides, and of course, pleasure. After leaving the chiefdom of Capachecchi, the Spanish made its way to the paramount chiefdom of Akut, Kofiki Atsamaha, Ichisi, at one point were tributary to the Akut chiefdom. Now, archaeologists state that the Okut Valley region was occupied for thousands of years. Now, at the time of DeSoto's arrival to the area, the chiefdoms he interacted with were in existence for at least 400 years. While within the Okut territory, DeSoto learned about the art of barbacoa, modern-day barbecue, and the first recorded instance of it in Georgia. He also learned of the paramount chiefdom Cafetachecki, which was located near present-day Camden, South Carolina, who was at war with the Georgia Indians. Now, due to the long-standing war between the two chiefdoms, a portion of the Savannah River Valley chiefdoms abandoned their lands and amalgamated with their allies of the Akut chiefdoms. It was also because of the blood that has been shed between the two chiefdoms why they gladly informed the Spanish of them and guided them towards the province. The chief of that region personally supplied the Spanish with 4,000 Indians to act as porters, carrying food and supplies that the tribe also gifted the conquistadors to supplement them during their journey. Now, an additional 4,000 on top of that, Indians were supplied, this time warriors, who would act as guides and military support for the Spanish. This geopolitical change resulted in a huge wilderness buffer that separated the Cafetachecki from them. Now, this would create a no man's land as a form of peace. The chief supplied all of the warriors, not because he truly cared about the Spanish succeeding in their mission, but because of their superior weapons of mass destruction, such as firepower and horses. So instead, the Indians could instigate wars with their more powerful enemies, with the advantage of their new friends and the weapons they brought with them. While guiding the Spanish into another paramount chief territory, the Indian warriors carried out several revenge slaughtering, killing both men and women, as well as desecrating and robbing temples. Now, another point that will be reiterated throughout this video is the fact that the Europeans were not just stumbling into these locations due to luck or coincidence. These areas were studied, and intel was collected on these ancient port cities and trading centers. With that being said, whenever the Spaniards had no more need for the village they currently occupied, they forced the Indians to tell them about other areas where they might find riches, food, and powerful rulers who they could either trade with or conquer. those unfortunate captured Indians were usually forced to aid the Spanish or threatened with death. Most importantly, settlements were left at a majority of the areas they stopped throughout, and strategic areas were being prepared for becoming future trading centers and Spanish colonies. Now, an interesting fact that was recorded during the Spanish explorations of Florida that definitely happened in all the other areas as well being conquered was the employment of mestizo children from the Spanish soldiers and the indigenous women in the conquistadors' conquest. Now, with this practice, you would have mestizos who were trained in the customs of their Indian tribes, as it was common for the children to be whatever their mother was and to be trained by the men on their maternal side. This was the best source of intel for the neighboring regions that you could possibly get. This gave the Spaniards a huge advantage in their conquests and can explain how they were able to successfully traverse through many areas and defeat so many. An example of this would be the son of a Spaniard named Vasco Porcayo. He was a conquistador who was a part of Florida and Honduras missions, and an indigenous person from Cuba. Their son would be named Diego Porcala de Figueroa. De Soto eventually made his way to the chiefdom of Confederachequi, which was at the time ruled by a female known as the Lady of Confederachequi. The female ruler acquired rule from her late husband, and according to evidence, the founding date of the chiefdom is said to be around the year 1300, and it was still in existence as a powerhouse during expeditions by Juan Pardo in the 1560s and Henry Woodward in the 1670s. The inhabitants of the chiefdom would have likely been aware of the foreigners, as the Spanish who came exploring with Allion during the 1520s gained knowledge of them from the Winyah and explored close to them at present-day Sapelo Sound. A huge portion of the modern state of South Carolina was said to be tributaries of this huge and powerful paramount Mississippian chiefdom. So, the thought of a smaller tribe giving up information about it under the threat of the Spanish is highly likely. De Soto, he knew of the riches that they possessed, and not only did he empty their food stores to feed his men, women, and animals that was with him, he also continued to rob ancient burials, to steal any precious stones and other treasures buried with the deceased Indian nobility. Now, a description of the burial complex was given from the De Soto expedition, which gave a vivid, and when I say vivid, I mean extremely vivid description of the craftsmanship and beauty of their temples. Within the temples, the Spanish found against the four walls wooden chests which housed benches where the deceased chiefs sat, mummified, of course, and this was a similar practice of the Inca and other Mesoamerican indigenous cultures practice. Now, beside the mummies were smaller chests that were filled with woven cane baskets, filled with large amounts of pearls, seed pearls, clothing, and animal skins. And that one room alone was said to be more than 25,000 pounds of pearls, 500 pounds of various gems, and large amounts of animal skins. An even larger temple that had its roof made of reed and cane, which was woven together so tight that even rain could not get through. Over the roof, it was said to have large and small shells laid about to where the natural luster shined in the sun. The shells were placed with the inside facing up while being surrounded by pearls and seeded pearls. Inside the temple stood 12 giant lifelike wooden warriors guarding the entrance to the temple. Each warrior had life-size weapons carved as well as they seemed to be ready to attack any intruder. Some carried bow and arrows, while others carried battle axes, clubs, and pikes. The ceiling was described as being adorned with shells with strings of pearls and great headdresses. The pearls and feathers hung from the ceiling on a light color string at different levels to give the illusion of feathers and pearls being poured from the roof. Inside the tombs were lifelike wood carvings of the deceased, who were buried with treasures and weapons. It almost sounds like a sarcophagus, but hey, what do I know? Now, this description, along with several others, you will notice that the artistic renderings of the many indigenous societies of the Southeast is just seem to make it look like they were in the Stone Age, or that these areas were not as grand as they really were, or as grand as their Mesoamerican neighbors, when in reality, the temples were just as large in the Southeast. Their culture was just as strong, their cities just as big and beautiful, and their warriors were just as feared. The lackluster descriptions that we see in modern times about the Southeast are all a part of a plot to make it seem that somehow the Indians fared better with the conquering of their lands. Well, newsflash, they did not, and immensely rich areas were purposely destroyed to not leave a trace of the powerful kingdoms they once had. The region of the chiefdom was rich with freshwater pearls, copper, and mica. After enslaving others and kidnapping the chief, he made her accompany him while he searched for the next area of interest, which would be the Jora tribe. She was able to escape from the Spanish. However, they made off with about 200 pounds of pearls and mica, which the area was known for. It was later reported that she married a Negro slave that escaped from that expedition and continued to rule. It is believed that DeSoto was hoping to find the famed city of Yupaha, which was said to be an area rich with gold. Some believe that Yupaha was just an alternate name for Kafetacheki. However, others believe that this site was in Georgia. Now, in my research, I found that the area of Yupaha most likely was near Blairsville, Georgia, and is located in the gold region where future gold mines of Talonega is located. This would mean that the indigenous people knew gold was in that region, and those stories made their way to DeSoto. This brings me to a theory that I came up with. The Spanish definitely found gold all throughout the Southeast. However, because they were not able to get a strong foothold in these new lands as they were able to do in Peru and Mexico, which is why it was never publicized. And let's be clear, the purity of the gold here in the Southeast, where the initial gold rush was, is said to be way purer than the gold that was found on the West Coast during their gold rush. Now, however, like I said, publicizing such, a rich discovery when other European nations were now coming to America to colonize and find monopolies would be a sure way to unnecessarily go to war with them. Now, regardless of where the site was located, it's believed that the site was inhabited by a group of Mayans who escaped Mesoamerica during the fall of their civilization around the year 900. The Chontal Maya, who referred to themselves as Poton, were from the Ocala province, in which is strikingly similar to the Ocala in Florida, which De Soto crossed paths with and recorded them as the Potano. Things get even more interesting when it's documented that the southernmost region of Ocala in Florida was called Ukitan, which is a rendering of Yucatan, another name for the Chontal Maya, and the name of the Yucatan region, which get its name from the people. There is a very strong connection between the different cultures of the Americas, whether in the Caribbean, Mesoamerica, South America, or the modern United States, that has been severely overlooked. Most scholars would like to point to Africa when making connections to the different American cultures, even though logically and logistically it would make more sense to make these connections with the different regions of the Americas for several reasons. The first reason would be that there were lots of migrations from South America to the Caribbean, as the Arawak, Taino, and Caribs all have their origins there. Now, secondly, the Maya once called the region of southwest Florida home, as well as other nearby areas. Many tribes from the eastern seaboard region of the U.S., the southeast, such as, the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, they had kinsmen who were sent to the Caribbean as slaves. For instance, the French enslaved the Natchez of Mississippi and shipped a lot of the Indians, especially those of royal lineage, to Saint Domingue, modern day Haiti, as the great son and the little son, along with the rest of their family, who were actually the royal line of the Natchez, they were documented being sent to Haiti as slaves in 1731. You would have the Pequot of modern Connecticut, who were labeled extinct, but not before being enslaved and relocated to Bermuda by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth, Saybrook, and the Connecticut colonies in the 1630s. And actually, the people who are actually there now on the St. David Island actually claim descent from those who survived from those early slaves that were sent from Massachusetts area to Connecticut area that were sent over to Bermuda. They are said to be the descendants of those Indian slaves. You also had the Goose Creek Men bring slaves from the Caribbean to Charleston, South Carolina. You had Mission Indians from Spanish Florida taken to Cuba, while others from Florida outside of the missions were taken to Charleston. Indians from Winyah Bay and modern Georgetown County were taken to the Dominican Republic, and many other tribes to several other regions all over the Americas and their respective islands. The third and my last batch of reasons for now, of many, because there are many connections, but is the fact that many of the cultures of the Americas had a similar hierarchy within their tribes. All kept a perpetual sacred fire that was revered and never allowed to go out. They used similar weapons and waged wars in similar fashions. They all had shamans who served the same purposes in very similar fashion. And believe it or not, when you get to your hoodoo or voodoo or rootwork or Santeria or Cadoble, all of those different spirituality systems, they all have ties to the different parts of Americas. However, as we'll discuss in later videos, they all give credit to Africa when a lot of those practices were already here. And we'll get into that later. But they all kept similar festivals. They all had similar deities. They all played the same ball games and had the same funerary customs. Now, returning to the path of DeSoto, after traveling through Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina, he made his way to North Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama, where he fought where he faced his toughest opponent. Now, if you don't know, that was the paramount chief of Mabila, known as Tuscaloosa, which means black warrior, by the way, for those who are curious. Now, looking for more treasure to loot, more food, more supplies to deplete, more fresh labor to secure from the indigenous captives, and most importantly, an overland route from Mexico to the southeast. DeSoto had his work cut out for him. Now, it's important to realize that a lot of the European nations that were at war with each other, their conflicts would spread over to the Americas and become the issues of not only the foreigners, but their indigenous allies as well. Since the beginning of time, there's been people that made a living from armed robbery, and during the age of exploration, there would be no exceptions. Many Spanish ships would be attacked by pirates, while their treasure ships made their way from Mexico to the Caribbean, where they would then make their way to Europe. So much, so much that they had to be escorted by the infamous galleon warships. Spain needed to find an alternate route to avoid being targets to the real pirates of the Caribbean, not your Jack Sparrows. Which is funny because, that series, it actually deals with a lot of the stuff that was actually happening around this time. So if you've never watched the series, it may be worth to give it a try if you're into that type of stuff. Now, a famous pirate that would plague the Pacific side of Mexico, especially Huatulco, Oaxaca, which got its name from his destruction, was Thomas Cavendish. In 1587, he hit the jackpot when he was able to capture a Manila galleon named Santa Ana, weighing 600 tons, filled with gold, silver, silk, and other treasures. This looting, the biggest payout England ever had, and to honor Cavendish, Queen Elizabeth knighted him. His tale would also live on in festivals of the Yucatan Peninsula, such as the burning of Bad Mood at Carnival in Campeche, where a rag doll dressed like a pirate is paraded inside of a coffin before being burned. These were the type of issues that DeSoto worked on avoiding and why he was making his way throughout the Southeast. Moving their gold and treasures from Mexico overland through the Gulf region, making their way to the coast of South Carolina, would put them on a safer path back to Europe. And that is why DeSoto took the paths that he did, because one of his goals were actually to find that overland route from Mexico to the southeast, where they would have already set up a colony, which would have been St. Helena, and they could have gone from there with the treasure ships rather than going through the Gulf of Mexico, going through where the pirates of the Caribbean were. Now, once in the Coosa region, DeSoto began demanding items such as women, deerskin, food, and porters, which he received since he often had an important chief captive while making these requests. He was documented sending several women to Mexico that he captured while in this region. After being involved in the conquest of Mexico and Peru, DeSoto figured out that he could control the largest and fiercest tribes by taking their chief hostage. Now, it was risky, but if it was properly calculated, it would be success. However, if not, it would mean certain death. So the Spaniards were all about getting their demands met, and also with their safety guaranteed. So as long as they would have had a chief in their possession, they would have been good to go. So making his way through the territory, he finally came in contact with Tuscaloosa, who already knew about the conquistadors and had his warriors prepared for battle. Many southeastern tribes knew by now that the Spanish were not to be trusted and made up their minds to fight to the death. Tuscaloosa was described by Rodrigo Rangel, De Soto's personal secretary on his expedition, as a large and muscular man, standing over a feet taller than the Spaniards. He was said to have on a headdress similar to that of the Moors of Spain, while wearing a mantle of feathers that came down to his feet, and as others, such as Moctezuma, Atahualpa, and the Lady of Confetechequi, sat on a litter of pillows and had servants with fans. Now, doing the same display of power that he did in Mexico and Peru, hoping to strike fear in the paramount chief, the Spaniards got on their horses and played the military game known as Juego de Canas. The game itself was introduced to the Spaniards by the Moors and consisted of throwing canes similar to spears at the horsemen as they used their shields to block them while also making combat charges and escaping. Just like the other warrior chiefs of the Americas, Tuscaloosa remained unfazed. After the display, it was said that the Indians then prepared a feast and danced in the main square, entertaining De Soto and his crew. When the Spanish demanded their usual tribute of food, porters, and lodging from the chief, he was quoted saying something along the lines of, he was used to being served and not serving others. Tuscaloosa then had the Spanish go to the city of Mabila to collect on the goods promised, which turned out to be a trap for the Spanish. Upon arrival to the village, the Spanish must have realized that they were walking into an ambush. The village was filled with mainly men, and those men were all of fighting age. And there were a few women for distraction purposes, but no children to be found, which is weird when you have a village of young men who are warriors and women. They also noticed that the village was freshly fortified and the warriors were having military skirmishes as if preparing for battle. The site of this village is believed to be the Big Eddy Phase Tuskegee Mound, which is known as Mound at Fort Toulouse at Fort Jackson Park. The Indians greeted them with music and dancing, as if to distract them or ease their mind. The Spanish were said to notice a strange feeling, as several big houses were newly constructed and seemed to be storing either warriors or weapons for a surprise attack. They became very wary of the Indians when 2 Spaniards went missing, and the Indians' response to the inquiry were rather harsh. An argument shortly ensued, and the chief was said to have his arm cut off. Now, it was at that moment the warriors attacked the Spanish. All of the warriors that were hidden in the surrounding houses ran out and attacked the Spaniards as they tried to flee. Now, this was said to be one of the bloodiest battles in America, lasting about 9 hours and involving thousands. The palisades were breached, houses were burned, many Indians were burned, arrows flew, axes and swords were swung, and many died. It was estimated that around 20 Spaniards died, with hundreds more being injured and several thousand of Indians being killed. Every Indian was said to fight relentlessly to the death and refuse to run from the conquistadors. They knew what would become of them if they surrendered, as news about what the Spanish was truly up to had reached almost every region in the southeast, especially east of the Mississippi by that point. All of the Indians were either killed or taken as slaves, or they took their own lives. Now, a special few who were not enslaved made it to nearby provinces where they told of the slaughter and the strange men on strange beasts, which gave the Indians time to prepare themselves. For the first time since starting their journey, DeSoto hit a brick wall and faced an adversary that killed his hopes of being able to complete his mission at hand. Instead of regrouping with Spanish ships that was just off the coast, he decided to continue going forward with his mission, even though he knew it was pointless. Now, after ravaging the Mississippian chiefdom, the remaining Spaniards, even though heavily wounded, made their way to yet another chiefdom. Now, this one was known as Chickaza, where things went from bad to worse. Now, the Chickaza were the indigenous controlled society that would later be known as the Chickasaw, which is when it was actually usurped. Now, being known as the civilized tribe, but the distinction between the two are subtle, but very important. In an introduction that would affect the Southeast for centuries to come, DeSoto once again finding himself fighting a vicious battle with the natives in which he barely escaped. Many died, and per usual, the Indians lost more men. The Spanish lost everything, all of the beautiful freshwater pearls that was taken from South Carolina, as well as their armor, and a portion of their weapons and horses. Whether he knew it or not, DeSoto was traveling through several different regions who were all culturally the same people known as the Mississippians, and he would not make it out of that territory alive. Narrowly escaping complete annihilation many times, one of the most prolific was during the Battle of Capaha or Quapua, where the Spanish and their allies, along with the Casqui Indians, attacked the Siouan-speaking tribe of Quapaw. After losing the battle and looking for a retreat, the Quapaw chief ordered his warriors to let the Spanish leave unharmed, as he seized this opportunity to make a deal with them. The kindness of the cacique's the kindness of his heart, I should say, seems strange to me, since his ancestors' remains, which they highly revered, by the way, was molested and disrespected to the max. Now, it was said that the enemies not only toppled over the sepulchres that the mummified remains sat in, but also desecrated and destroyed the remains. But back to DeSoto. He later succumbed to his injuries and was buried on the bank of the Mississippi River. Before their leader died, however, Luis de Moscoso Alvarado was made leader of the expedition. From Mississippi, they tried to go through Louisiana and Texas before returning to the Mississippi River, where they made rafts and made their way towards Mexico, which was more challenging than I guess they expected because more of their men died. Now, this of course would be from the battling with the chiefdom of Quegualatum. Now, after several failures, they finally made it to Mexico City, where their tales made them heroes in 1543. With all this, it's easy to see why the Timucua were excited to team up with the Huguenots to destroy the Spanish. The southeast region would undergo a series of reconstructions, and many strong tribes that had their numbers depleted due to war or having their food stores depleted or destroyed must have faced apocalyptic type outcomes. And out of this grew new alliances and tribes and a new way of life for the Mississippian tribes, which brought an end to their former way of life and glory. Now, it's actually around this time, I think a lot of those ancient sites and mounds were basically evacuated or destroyed. Now, with that being said, we'll come back to the Southeast later, just to address these same regions and their interactions with the other European nations that would come to their lands to finish what the Spanish have started. Now, in the next video, however, we will discuss the result of the Spanish presence in the Lowcountry and why the capital had to relocate further south to St. Augustine, becoming the longest continuously inhabited European city in the United States. Now, not to leave you on a cliffhanger, that reason it was the Escamacu Wars. So, tune in next time as I tell you untold stories and history of the Lowcountry and the Escamacu Wars, which essentially drove the Spanish from the coastal regions of South Carolina and Georgia and pushed them to where they made their new capital at St. Augustine. Thank you for joining and have a good one.